So with this amazing decade of NASCAR coming to an end, it's a good time to take a look at the top 10 drivers of the 2010s. But first, we'll take a look at a few honorable mentions that just missed out on the top 10. Clinton Boyer is the first honorable mention on our list. He racked up some wins in the 2010s, but I think what really killed his chance of being in the top 10 list was that long winless streak he had between 2012 and 2018. I think if he was able to rack up wins and show a lot of championship speed within those years, he could easily be in that top 10. But we'll just see what happens next decade. Kurt Busch is the next honorable mention, and he's actually become quite a fan favorite as of the past couple years. He's racked up, as Boyer, a lot of wins in the 2010s. Not a championship, but he came close in a couple seasons. I think he could have been in that top 10 list if in 2012 he was at one of the worst cars in the field, and he still almost won Sonoma, and he ran up front at a lot of races. That year he didn't get any wins, and there was a couple other seasons that he could have racked up a lot more wins had he been more fortunate, and if he was more fortunate in this decade, I think he would be in that top 10 list, but not quite. And Tony Stewart is the final honorable mention, and he's the only champion of this decade outside the top 10 list. He was really good in the first couple seasons of the decade, but after that he just faded off, and that's mostly why he missed out on the top 10 list. Jeff Gordon will start off the list in number 10. He racked up quite a lot of wins about in the mid-period of the decade. He's one of the greatest drivers of all time. But definitely better in the 90s and even the 2000s than he was in the 2010s. And, he racked up some pretty big wins, like in 2015 when he won that Martinsville race, got him in the Final Four. That was big. But he could have been a lot higher if he had captured a championship in 2014, which I think that was definitely the best year of his decade. Now, Carl Edwards is 9th on the list. He got a lot of wins on the decade and won in almost every year he raced in the decade. However, he did not get a championship. There was a couple years where he could have got the championship, like in 2011. He lost in a tiebreaker to Tony Stewart. That's the only time in NASCAR history that there was a tie for the championship. Tony had more wins, so he got the title. And then in 2016, he made a late block on Logano and took himself out of championship contention. He could have won that year as well. But overall, a pretty solid decade for Carl. Matt Kenseth is 8th placed on the list, and Matt got a lot of wins in this decade before his retirement in 2017. He won the Daytona 500 in 2012, which probably the highlight of his decade. He didn't win a championship in this decade, even though he did win one in the 2000s. Really good decade for Matt Kenseth, and a good way to end his career. Joey Logano is 7th on the list. He did not have a great start to the decade. He raced at Joe Gibbs and only racked up one win there for this decade, 2 in total in his tenure there. However, when he went to Penske, he immediately upped up his game. He won a Daytona 500 in 2015, and then the highlight of his decade, a championship in 2018. A great decade for him, and he's actually the first champion on this list. Okay, so I was going back and forth between Truex and Logano for the 6th place position on this list, but I ended up giving it to Truex. He had a great decade, not a great start to it, similar to Logano, but then once he went to Furniture Row, in 2015 he made the Final Four, lost the championship, but then he started getting wins. A championship in 2017, the highlight of his decade for sure, and he's been racking up tons of wins ever since, and I expect that win count to go even higher next decade. Now, Denny Hamlin is the highest driver on this list without a championship. This year he came so close to getting a championship. In 2010, he racked up all those 8 wins in total, still didn't get the championship, and he's had a very good decade. He won 2 Daytona 500s in 2016 and 2019, the most of anybody in this decade. So that's a big accomplishment right there. As I said, he could have multiple championships right now if he were a little more lucky. Very solid decade for Denny Hamlin, and it's going to be interesting to see what he can do next decade. I expect him to rack up more wins and hopefully get a championship. Now, Brad Keselowski is 4th place on the list. I think he might just be the most underrated driver of the decade. Nobody really gives him the credit he deserves. He won the championship in 2012. And he's been racking up tons of wins ever since. I think he's like in the 30s or 40s in his overall career win count. He's just been doing so good this decade, and he's kind of in an interesting pattern lately where he's had a good first half of the season and then a slump in the second half. He's going to need to clean that up if he wants to get another championship, which I think he can very well get for next decade. So Brad Keselowski fourth. Kevin Harvick is third on this list. Now, he has made a massive gain from Richard Childress Racing to Stewart Haas Racing. In both teams, he showed the same skill, talent, and speed. However, the biggest difference, he showed consistency at Stewart Haas Racing and was actually able to compete for championships. And as we saw in 2014, he did capture that finally capture that first championship. And he's got so many wins lately. It's mine. I think he got his 50th win in Texas, which is just crazy. I didn't even realize he had that much wins until they said it. So great decade for Harvick, and I expect him to end his career next decade on a high. Now I have Jimmie Johnson second on this list. He's one of only 2 drivers to capture multiple championships in this decade, and he's got so many wins. He's got like 83 career wins now. A lot of them were in this decade. Obviously, he was better in the 2000s with all those championships, but he did capture 3 championships in this decade, the most of anybody in 2010, 13, and 16. He won a Daytona 500 in 2013. So that was a big year for him to get both the 500 and the championship in the same year. He's got so many wins, but I think what really kept him from being first on this list was his recent slump. Ever since probably midway through 2017, he's just not been the same driver. We'll see what happens next decade, and ending his career after 2020, that'll be an interesting year to see. Now, Kyle Busch is my best driver of the 2010s. This is going to be very controversial, but, a lot of people hate him. But he has 2 championships. He has so many wins. And, I was going back and forth with him and Johnson for the top spot, but he has been good almost every year in this decade. While Jimmie Johnson, he can't really say that. He's had some bad seasons. Kyle Busch hasn't really had any. There was a period in the early 2010s where he would win a lot of races, but, not be consistent enough to get the championship. But, still, good seasons for him. Solid seasons there. And a little side note, and this has nothing to do with his overall ranking, but his lower series wins. He has so many wins in the Xfinity Series, the Truck Series, and, he has way over 200 wins in all 3 series combined right now. The only thing I hate about it is people are saying he's better than Richard Petty because of it, but he's not. If he gets 200 Cup wins, then we can start talking about that. But, just solid decade for Kyle Busch, and he's my number 1 pick. Now I want to know who you think is the greatest NASCAR driver of the decade. Vote in the poll at the top right of your screen, or put your full top 10 picks in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.